The mafia boss was lonely. Nobody remembered his birthday. Lorenzo Caruso switched off his phone screen with a sharp flick. 0 messages, 0 missed calls. The clock struck 8 in the evening, and the man who controlled half of Chicago's underground empire realized a crushing truth. Today, he turned 37 years old, and the whole world couldn't care less. His office on the 50th floor of Caruso Tower sat in absolute silence. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the city glittered beneath his feet, but inside his chest there was only a frozen void. He'd sacrificed everything to reach the top. He'd crushed his enemies, eliminated anyone who stood in his way, built an empire soaked in blood and fear, and somewhere along the way he'd lost the ability to feel anything at all. The heavy oak door burst open, shattering the stillness. Genevieve walked in, his fiancée. Designer heels that cost more than most people's cars, a limited edition handbag, and an expression of pure irritation. She didn't even glance at him while scrolling through her phone. She snapped about the private jet not being ready for her weekend trip to Miami with her friends. Lorenzo loosened the knot of his silk tie. He stared at her, not searching for love in those eyes because he'd stopped looking long ago, but hoping for at least some trace of humanity. He said today was his birthday, his voice low and rough, hoping the words might make the world pause for just 1 second. Genevieve stopped her fingers on the screen, looked up for a fraction of a moment. No surprise, no guilt, just a flicker of annoyance at being interrupted. She waved her hand dismissively, told him he was 37 now, not a child begging for cake and candles. She'd already made reservations with her girlfriends. See you tomorrow. Oh, and leave your black card at reception, because hers got declined. Without waiting for an answer, Genevieve turned on her heel and left. The sound of her stilettos fading down the hallway was all that remained. Lorenzo stood frozen. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. This was his perfect life. This was the woman he'd chosen to secure his position. The perfect partner for political alliances between crime families. He was the most feared man in Chicago, but at this very moment, he felt like the most miserable creature on the face of the earth. He grabbed his navy blue suit jacket, tailored to fit his broad shoulders perfectly, and left the building. The drive to his mansion in Gold Coast felt like a silent funeral procession. While the engine of his Bentley roared through the illuminated streets, Lorenzo's mind drifted back 2.5 years. He remembered a genuine laugh. He remembered gentle green eyes. He remembered a nameless woman in a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of the city. The night after he'd barely survived an assassination attempt. The night 2 of his men died protecting him. The night he'd needed to forget who he was. She'd given him 1 night of being just a man, not a monster. And he'd left before dawn without a word, without a name, without looking back. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Regret was a slow poison. He arrived at his estate. The massive black iron gates opened automatically. The Caruso mansion loomed imposing and minimalist, cream-colored walls and enormous glass windows. It looked like a museum, a mausoleum of marble and glass where nothing ever happened outside of schedule. Lorenzo killed the engine and sighed deeply. All he wanted was to pour himself a glass of single malt whiskey, sink into his Italian leather sofa, and let this miserable day end in absolute perfect silence. He entered the security code at the main entrance. The electronic lock clicked open with a metallic sound. He pushed the heavy wooden door, but the silence he expected never came. What hit his ears was a sound that didn't belong to his world. A high-pitched shriek, followed by a burst of children's laughter echoing through the tall foyer. If you're hooked and want to know what happens next, smash that like button and share this story with someone who loves drama. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss a single twist. Now let's go back to see what Lorenzo found inside his mansion. Lorenzo yanked his Glock from the holster at his lower back on pure reflex. The reflex of a man who'd survived dozens of assassination attempts. He moved into the living room with soundless steps, his finger resting on the trigger, every sense pulled tight like a violin string. But what he saw made him stop dead in the doorway. 2 children, not yet 2, were perched boldly on his walnut coffee table worth $50,000, their tiny legs swinging in the air, their hands grabbing chunks of birthday cake and flinging them at each other like they were fighting the most glorious war of their lives. The little boy with ink-black hair and cold gray eyes was shrieking with laughter, while the little girl with chestnut brown hair and bright green eyes was trying to stuff an entire fistful of frosting into her brother's mouth. The antique Persian rug Lorenzo had bought at an auction in London was now smeared with chocolate. The ivory-white Italian leather sofa was speckled with tiny handprints, sticky with vanilla cream. The pristine white wall wore streaks of pink and blue from the cake's icing. All over the floor were crumbs, snapped birthday candles, paper plates, and curling ribbons. His perfect living room looked like it had just survived a sugar storm. And at the center of that storm, a woman in a gray housemaid uniform was bent over, wiping the little boy's face, her clear laughter ringing out, mingling with the children's babble. She had no idea the owner was home. Lorenzo lowered the gun slowly, not because the danger was gone, but because his brain was still trying to process what was in front of him. He opened his mouth to bark something, anything, but the woman turned at that exact moment. Everything stopped. Time froze. She saw him. He saw her. Those green eyes. Lorenzo felt as if someone had driven a fist straight into his chest. He'd seen those eyes before, under the dim lights of a bar on the outskirts of Chicago, on the night he wanted to forget who he was, the night he'd found peace in the arms of a nameless woman, 2.5 years ago. The woman stood there, her hands still smeared with frosting, her face draining as she recognized the man in front of her. She remembered too. Lorenzo could see it in the way her eyes widened, in the way she took one unconscious step back, in the way she lifted an arm to shield the 2 children behind her as if she were protecting them from a threat. The room fell into absolute silence. Even the children stopped misbehaving, their round eyes fixed on the tall man in a black suit standing like a statue in the doorway. No one spoke. No one moved. There was only the sound of Lorenzo's heart pounding like a war drum in his chest, and a single question looping in his mind as his gaze slid from the woman to the little boy with ink-black hair and gray eyes, then back to the woman again. Those gray eyes. He saw himself in them every day when he looked in the mirror. Wren Callahan took another step back, placing herself between Lorenzo and the 2 children like a living shield. She recognized him. Even though 2.5 years had passed, even though that night neither of them had traded names, she still recognized those steel-cold gray eyes, recognized the sharp angles of that face, recognized the broad shoulders and the posture of a man used to dominating every room he entered. Her heart hammered wildly in her chest, but she didn't allow fear to rise to her face. She'd survived 14 years in foster care, survived 21 months, raising 2 children on her own. She wasn't going to crumble just because she'd run into the man who'd vanished into dawn without a single goodbye. Footsteps sounded from the hallway, breaking the thick tension in the room. Frank DeLuca appeared, an old butler with snow-white hair and clear, knowing eyes that flicked quickly over the chaos in front of him. He didn't look surprised by Lorenzo's presence, only dipped his head in greeting, and began to explain in a calm voice as if he were delivering a weather report. He said Miss Wren Callahan had been assigned by Sterling Household Services to start work today, exactly as scheduled by the Human Resources Department. Her daycare center had shut down on an emergency basis due to a staffing shortage. She had no relatives or friends to watch the children, and because today was her first day, she couldn't take time off. He'd allowed her to bring the 2 children in on the condition that she keep them in the kitchen, but clearly that plan hadn't succeeded. In a moment of pure toddler curiosity, they had spotted the cake box on a low delivery cart and managed to push it into the foyer while Frank was momentarily distracted with an urgent security update at the gate. Frank finished by pointing to the ruined birthday cake on the table, explaining that it was a cake he'd ordered for Lorenzo, meant to be kept in the refrigerator until he came home, but the children had found it. Lorenzo didn't say a word. He stood there, his eyes never leaving the little boy sitting on the table. Noah. He heard Frank say the child's name, Noah Callahan. The boy was about 21 months old, with ink-black hair that looked exactly like Lorenzo's hair when he'd been little in the photographs his mother used to keep. Cold gray eyes, not an ordinary gray, but the gray of a sky before a storm. The exact same color he saw every morning in the mirror, the way the boy tilted his head to one side while studying a stranger. Lorenzo had always done that. The shape of his face, the straight bridge of his nose, the high forehead, even the way the boy furrowed his brow when he was confused, made Lorenzo feel like he was staring at a miniature version of himself. He did the math in his head. 21 months old. Add 9 months of pregnancy. That made 30 months. 2.5 years. That night at the bar had happened exactly 2.5 years ago. The timing lined up perfectly. Lorenzo finally spoke, his voice not shaking at all, but so cold it could freeze the air. He told Wren to clean up this mess. Tomorrow he'd decide whether he was keeping her on or not. Then he turned and walked away, his steps steady but a storm raging inside his mind. He didn't look back at the little girl with green eyes clinging tightly to her mother's hand. And he didn't look back at Ren standing there with eyes that held both fear and defiance. He went straight into his study and slammed the door. That night, when the clock struck 2 a.m. and the entire estate lay silent, Lorenzo picked up the phone and called Jason Romano. His tone allowed no questions. He ordered Jason to come to the mansion first thing tomorrow morning and secretly obtain DNA samples from the 2 children by any means. Hair, saliva, anything. Then send them to the Caruso family's private lab for urgent testing. No one was to know about this, not even Frank. The results had to be in within 48 hours. Jason didn't ask why. He never did. After he hung up, Lorenzo sat in the darkness of his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand that he didn't drink, his gaze fixed on the wall. If he was right, if that boy really was his son, then Lorenzo Caruso's life was about to change completely, and for the first time in many years, he didn't know whether he was ready for it. That night, 2.5 years ago, Lorenzo Caruso walked into a suburban Chicago bar with blood still smeared on the sleeve of his dress shirt. The assassination attempt had happened only 3 hours earlier. His convoy had been ambushed on Interstate 90. 2 SUVs had exploded. Gunfire had fallen like rain in the dark. 2 bodyguards had died to shield him, their bodies left on the freezing asphalt, while Lorenzo was hauled into an armored vehicle and rushed away. He hadn't even been able to close their eyes. He didn't even remember the younger guard's name, the kid who was only 23 and had welcomed his first baby just a week earlier. That night, Lorenzo didn't want to go back to the mansion, didn't want to listen to Jason report the damage, didn't want to plan revenge. He only wanted to disappear, only wanted to forget that he was Lorenzo Caruso, the boss everyone wanted dead. He parked outside a small bar in the suburbs that no mafia man bothered to enter, a place where dim lights and worn old jazz could swallow a soul that was falling apart. At the very same time, Ren Callahan sat in the darkest corner of the bar with a bottle of cheap whiskey in front of her. Her hands were still shaking from the phone call 4 hours earlier. Megan, her only real friend, the one who'd stood by her through the foster care years, the only person in the world who'd ever called her family, had died of late-stage cancer. Ren hadn't made it in time to say goodbye. She'd been working the night shift at the hospital when Megan took her last breath alone in a cold hospice room. Ren didn't cry. She'd forgotten how to cry a long time ago, but she needed to forget, needed to drown the pain in anything that could hold it under. Lorenzo sat at the bar 3 stools away from her and ordered a bottle of Macallan without looking at anyone. He drank as if the liquor were air. Ren glanced sideways and saw the dark red stain on his sleeve, but she wasn't afraid. Tonight she had nothing left to lose. Their eyes met in the mirror behind the bar. No one spoke. No one needed to. They recognized each other, not by identity or history, but by the pain chewing through the other's soul. 2 broken strangers finding each other in the ruins of their own lives. Lorenzo moved to sit beside her. He didn't ask her name, and she didn't ask his. They talked about meaningless things, the jazz track playing overhead, the rain tapping the window, how Chicago felt colder than usual tonight. But under the small talk was an understanding that didn't need words. At 1 a.m, the bar closed. At 2 a.m, they were in a cheap motel room 2 blocks away. No promises, no future, only one night to forget the world outside. Lorenzo found peace in her green eyes, and Ren found warmth in the arms of a dangerous stranger. At 5 a.m, Lorenzo's phone vibrated. A message from Jason said the rival family was gathering forces and the boss needed to come back immediately. Lorenzo looked at the woman sleeping beside him, her brown hair spilled across the white pillow, her face peaceful for the first time all night. He got up, dressed, and left without a word of goodbye. He didn't leave a phone number. He didn't leave a name. He left nothing but an empty space on the rumpled bed. When Ren woke up an hour later, she found only dawn sunlight pushing through the curtains and a cold, hollow absence. She wasn't surprised. She was used to being left behind. She got dressed and walked out, thinking she'd never see that nameless man again. She was wrong. In the present, in the shadowed corner of the Caruso mansion study at 3 a.m, Frank DeLuca sat alone beneath the pool of a desk lamp. He'd watched enough today. The way Lorenzo stared at the little boy Noah, the way the boss's eyes turned turbulent when he noticed the resemblance. Frank wasn't foolish. He'd served the Caruso family for 40 years. He knew when a storm was coming, and this storm would be enormous. He opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet and pulled out a stack of documents yellowed with age, a file on the Ashworth family, on Victor Ashworth and the dark secrets Frank had collected over the past 20 years. He didn't know exactly when he'd need it, but the instincts of a man who'd survived 3 family wars told him that day wasn't far away. 48 hours passed like torture. Lorenzo barely slept, barely ate. He only sat in his study waiting for the call from the lab. He avoided Ren and the children, ordered Frank to keep them in the east wing of the mansion, while he waited for the truth. On the morning of the 3rd day, the phone vibrated. Dr. Harrison Wells, the Caruso family physician for 20 years, the only man Lorenzo trusted with secrets that meant life or death. His voice was calm, but Lorenzo could hear the caution tucked into every word. The results were in. Lorenzo Caruso was the biological father of Noah Callahan and Emma Callahan, with a probability of 99.97%. There was no error. The test had been run twice to ensure accuracy. Lorenzo ended the call without another word. He stood motionless in the middle of the study, a printed sheet of results in his hand that Jason had just sent through a secure fax. The letters and numbers danced in front of his eyes. 99.97%. Almost absolute. He was the father. He had children, 2 of them, 1 boy and 1 girl, Noah and Emma. For 21 months, what had he been doing? He'd been living in a $1 million mansion, sleeping on Egyptian silk sheets, drinking $1,000 liquor every night, while his own blood, 2 children carrying Caruso blood, had been living in a miserable studio apartment on the south side. He'd read the report Jason had compiled on Ren Callahan, on the cramped 1-room apartment where she and the 2 babies had been squeezed together, on the 3 jobs she'd been working at once just to afford formula and diapers, on the nights she'd stayed awake with sick children and no money to take them to a doctor. Guilt crushed Lorenzo like a massive slab of concrete pressing down on his chest. He'd left her in that motel room without a single word. He'd left her to face everything alone. He'd never come back to look for her, even though those green eyes had haunted him for months after that night. Lorenzo gripped the paper until it crumpled in his fist. He wasn't used to this feeling, the feeling of guilt, the feeling of regret. In his world, he wasn't allowed to be weak. He wasn't allowed to make mistakes, but this was the biggest mistake of his life. He picked up the intercom phone, his voice cold and clipped. "Tell Ren Callahan to come to the study immediately." 5 minutes later, the oak door opened. Ren stepped inside, still in her gray housemaid uniform, her hair pinned up neatly, her face blank but her green eyes alert. She didn't know why she'd been summoned, but a survival instinct, sharpened by years of taking care of herself, made her build her walls. Lorenzo closed the door, the click of the lock echoing through the silent room. He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable, then walked to the desk. The DNA results were thrown down onto the oak surface in front of her with a dry, hard smack. "Read it." Ren looked down, her eyes skimming the lines, and her world collapsed. Ren read the paper once, then twice, then 3 times. The words swam in front of her eyes, each one driving straight through her chest. Lorenzo Caruso. That was his name, the most notorious mafia boss in Chicago. The biological father of Noah and Emma with a probability of 99.97%. Her knees wanted to buckle, but she forced herself to stay upright. She couldn't fall. She couldn't be weak. Not in front of him. The page trembled in her hands, and her face went as pale as the paper she was holding. Lorenzo watched every reaction flicker across her features, his cold gray eyes missing nothing. Then he spoke, his voice edged with accusation, slicing through the thick air. "Why didn't you look for me? You knew you were pregnant and you didn't even bother to find the children's father. You hid my kids for 21 months. Ren lifted her head and looked at him, and something inside her detonated. 21 months of hell. 21 months of fighting alone to keep 2 babies alive. 21 months of swallowing her tears because there was no one to lean on. It all boiled up into a fury she couldn't hold back. "Look for you," she all but shouted, her voice shaking with rage. "How? You didn't leave a name. You didn't leave a phone number. You didn't leave a scrap of paper, a note, nothing. You disappeared before dawn like I was some prostitute you'd hired for the night. How was I supposed to find a ghost?" Lorenzo stayed silent, his jaw clenched tight. Ren didn't stop. She stepped toward him, her green eyes blazing. 21 months of bitterness pouring out like floodwater breaking a dam. "I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after that night. Alone. No family, no friends, because Megan was dead. No one to tell. I got fired from the hospital because my morning sickness was so bad I couldn't stand for an 8-hour night shift without throwing up bile." Losing my job meant losing my health insurance. Do you have any idea how much prenatal care costs in America without insurance? I skipped meals to save money for ultrasounds. I cleaned offices in a commercial building all the way into my 8th month because nobody hires a woman pregnant with twins for a desk job. Her voice trembled, but it wasn't weakness, and she kept going. I gave birth to Noah and Emma at Cook County Hospital, a public hospital because I couldn't afford anywhere else. Labor lasted 14 hours. Emma's cord was wrapped around her neck. I lost too much blood, and I almost died on that delivery table. Almost died. Alone. Nobody held my hand. Nobody signed consent forms if I passed out. Nobody to call if I didn't make it. Tears hovered, but she wouldn't let them fall. After I was discharged, I worked 3 jobs at once. Cleaning from 5 in the morning to 9. Waiting tables from 10 to 3 in the afternoon. Delivering food from 6 in the evening to 10 at night. I slept 4 hours a day if I was lucky. I went hungry so I could buy formula. I wore the same old clothes from foster care while Noah and Emma had enough diapers and milk. And you're standing here in your $1 million mansion, wearing a suit that costs more than my rent for a year, asking me why I didn't look for you. She stopped right in front of him, close enough to see the vein jumping at Lorenzo's temple. She stared straight into those gray eyes, and her voice dropped, cold as steel. I didn't hide your children, Lorenzo Caruso. You hid yourself from us. And let me make one thing very clear. She drew in a deep breath, and every word that followed landed like a blade. I survived without you, 21 months alone, and I still raised 2 healthy children. I still kept them safe. I still loved them with my whole heart. I didn't need you then, and I sure as hell don't need you now. Lorenzo stood there like he'd been nailed to the floor. He'd prepared himself for the DNA truth, but he hadn't prepared for this. He hadn't prepared for 21 months of suffering slamming into his face, for guilt crushing him under the weight of every word she spoke. He opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out, and in that silence, the familiar click of high heels sounded in the hallway outside, coming closer with every step. The study door flew open with a loud bang. Genevieve Ashworth stood in the doorway, her blonde hair perfect as if she'd just stepped out of a salon, a fitted white Chanel dress hugging her figure, red-soled Louboutins striking the wood floor like gunfire. She hadn't knocked. She hadn't asked permission, because in her mind, this mansion was about to be hers, and no one had the right to stop her from going anywhere she pleased. She'd flown from Miami back to Chicago for one reason: the black card Lorenzo had left for her at reception. Her only remaining source of luxury had been abruptly frozen by him while she was at the checkout counter. She'd tried to buy a limited edition Hermes bag at the Miami Design District and been refused in front of 2 friends. That humiliation was unforgivable. Genevieve stormed into the room, her mouth already open to scream for an explanation, but she stopped short when she took in the scene. Lorenzo stood in the middle of the study, his face carved from stone, and a few steps away from him was a woman in a cheap gray housemaid uniform, brown hair pinned up, a gaunt face but green eyes blazing as if she'd just survived a battle. A servant, in Lorenzo's study. Alone with him behind a closed door, Genevieve's eyes narrowed with suspicion. She looked from Lorenzo to Ren, then to the crumpled paper on the desk. The instincts of someone born into a world of schemes told her something was wrong. She walked to the desk and snatched up the paper before Lorenzo could stop her. Her eyes skimmed the lines. A DNA test. Lorenzo Caruso. Noah Callahan. Emma Callahan. 99.97%. Biological father. Silence held for exactly 3 seconds. Then hell broke loose. You whore. Genevieve screamed, her voice so shrill the entire mansion had to hear it. She spun toward Ren, her eyes burning with hatred. You low-class trap-setting trash. Who do you think you are? A cheap little maid, daring to sleep with my fiancé. Daring to pop out bastard kids to blackmail him. Ren didn't move, didn't flinch. She only stared at Genevieve with a cold, flat gaze. 21 months of raising her children alone had taught her not to fear anyone anymore, not even a woman born into silk and privilege. Genevieve turned on Lorenzo, the paper still shaking in her hand with rage. Explain this. What the hell is this? You slept with a maid. You have secret children and you hid it from me. Where did these bastards come from? Lorenzo looked at Genevieve, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to stay polite, didn't feel the need to maintain a flawless mask for a political marriage. He was tired of all of it. It happened before I met you, he said, his tone even. But yes, they're my children. And that changes everything. Changes everything. Genevieve let out a harsh laugh that sounded like breaking glass. You think you can toss me aside for the bastard kids of a maid? You think my father will let you? The alliance between Caruso and Ashworth is a blood agreement, Lorenzo. You can't break it just because you suddenly want to play father. She whirled back to Ren, her eyes wild. And you, get out of this house right now. Take your bastards with you. I'm not allowing you to stay here another second. Lorenzo stepped forward and placed himself between Genevieve and Ren. Enough. His voice was ice cold, cold enough that Genevieve took an involuntary step back. Our marriage is over. Right now. Genevieve's mouth fell open. You don't have the right. I have every right. Lorenzo cut in, each word as clear as a death sentence. This is my house. These are my children. And you, Genevieve, don't have any rights here anymore. You didn't even remember my birthday. You never cared about anything except credit cards and private jets. This marriage was just a business contract, and I've just terminated the contract. Genevieve stood frozen as if struck by lightning. For the past 3 years, she'd believed she held Lorenzo in the palm of her hand, because the alliance with her father was what he needed. She'd never imagined he'd dare throw it all away for a maid and 2 toddlers. Humiliation set her on fire from the inside out. You'll regret this, Genevieve hissed through clenched teeth, her voice cold as venom. My father will hear about this. Victor Ashworth will grind the Caruso family into dust. You just signed your own death warrant, Lorenzo. And your bastard kids, too. She spun and stalked out, her Louboutins striking the floor like a bomb's countdown. The door slammed behind her, but the threat still echoed in the thick air. Ren stood there, her heart racing, realizing she'd just been dragged into the middle of a war between the most powerful families in Chicago, and Lorenzo stared out the window at the city lights glittering below. And he knew the real storm was only beginning. 3 days after Genevieve left, Lorenzo's phone vibrated at 6 a.m. A message from an unknown number, but he knew immediately who it was. Victor Ashworth didn't need an introduction. There were no words, only 3 photographs. The first showed the miserable studio apartment on the south side where Ren had lived for the past 21 months, taken from the angle of someone standing across the street. The second showed the Little Stars daycare center, where Noah and Emma had gone every day before Ren took the job at the Caruso mansion. The photo clear enough to capture the license plates in the lot. The third showed the Aldi store where Ren usually shopped, the framing sharp enough to reveal the shelves of formula and diapers she always chose. The threat didn't need to be spelled out. Victor Ashworth was telling Lorenzo that he knew everything. He was watching everything, and he could reach them anytime he wanted. Lorenzo ground his teeth until his jaw twitched. He called Jason Romano immediately and ordered an emergency meeting with the capos within an hour. The conference room in the basement of Caruso Tower filled with faces cold as stone, men who'd walked through blood and fire beside Lorenzo for years. He threw his phone onto the table, the 3 photos lighting up the large screen. No one needed an explanation. They all understood what it meant. Victor Ashworth had declared war. Lorenzo gave short, final orders. Bring Ren Callahan and the 2 children into the estate immediately. Her old apartment wasn't safe anymore. Nowhere outside was safe anymore. 24/7 protection. At least 4 men rotating. No one was allowed near them except the people on the list he personally approved. Put eyes on Victor and the Ashworth family. Track every move. And the second there was any sign of an attack, report it. Jason nodded. The capos nodded. And no one asked questions. When the meeting ended and Lorenzo returned to the mansion, he had Ren brought to the living room so he could tell her. She'd been feeding Noah and Emma breakfast in the kitchen, her face still cold from the confrontation the other day. She listened, and then she exploded. No. Ren stood up, her green eyes on fire. I'm not living here. I'm not raising my children in a mafia house, surrounded by guns and violence. If you want to protect us, give us money so we can go far away. Another city, another state. But here, never. Lorenzo looked at her, his patience thinning to a thread. You think Victor Ashworth won't find you in another city. You think he doesn't have people everywhere. This is how this world works, Ren. You're in it now. Whether you want to be or not, I didn't choose to step into it. Ren shouted. I'm just a housemaid. I just wanted to make enough money to raise my kids. I didn't sign up for a family war. Lorenzo lost patience. He strode forward, grabbed her arm, and pulled her to the huge window overlooking the garden. What do you see out there? He asked, his voice cold as steel. Ren stared out, not understanding what he was trying to say. Trees, fences, sky, nothing special. Lorenzo continued, each word landing like a knife. Victor Ashworth, 4 years ago, had an enemy's entire family eliminated. The father, the mother, and their 5-year-old daughter. They found the child's body in a dumpster a week later. He didn't care if it was women or children. He only cared about sending a message. Ren stood frozen, the blood in her veins turning to ice. Lorenzo turned her to face him, his gray eyes locked on hers. If you walk out those gates, you and the children will be dead within 48 hours. I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you the truth. Victor won't kidnap you for ransom. He'll kill you and the children just to humiliate me, to show the underworld that no one betrays the Ashworth family and survives. You're the mother of my children. They carry Caruso blood. That makes you a target, whether you want it to or not. Ren searched his eyes for exaggeration, for a bluff. She found nothing but cold, merciless truth. He wasn't lying. This was his world, the world she'd accidentally stepped into on that fateful night 2.5 years ago. Her legs gave out. She dropped into the nearest chair, both hands clamped over her head, breathing fast and shallow. Noah and Emma, her tiny babies, were now targets of a bloodthirsty mafia kingpin only because of the blood running through their veins. The normal life she'd fought for across 21 months, the fragile hopes of a peaceful future, all of it dissolved into smoke. She looked toward the kitchen, where Noah and Emma's laughter still rang out as Frank played with them. Her heart broke. Normal life was over forever, and she had no choice but to stay inside this gilded cage, under the protection of a man she didn't know whether to trust or to hate. 2 a.m, 5 days later. The alarm siren tore through the silence of the Caruso mansion. The security system had detected movement in the east garden, where the fence backed onto a narrow alley hardly anyone used. Lorenzo was out of bed in less than 2 seconds, his hand closing around the Glock on the nightstand, his feet already hitting the floor before his brain had fully caught up with what was happening. He didn't run toward the garden where the breach had been detected. He ran straight to the children's room at the end of the second-floor hallway. The instincts of a man who'd lost his mother because he hadn't protected her in time told him the most important thing right now wasn't catching the enemy, it was making sure his blood was safe. He kicked the door open, gun raised, finger on the trigger, ready to fire. What he saw made him pause for a beat. Ren was awake. She sat in the darkest corner of the room, her back against the wall, both arms wrapped tight around Noah and Emma as if she could shield them from the entire world. Noah was hiccup, sobbing, and Emma clung to her mother's shirt, green eyes wide and fixed on the doorway. Ren lifted her head when she saw Lorenzo, her eyes blown wide with fear, but there was also the hard resolve of a mother willing to fight to her last breath. "They're here," Lorenzo said, his voice cold and steady, leaving no space for panic. "Don't leave this room. Lock the door after I go." He turned and stepped out, pulled the door shut, and planted himself in front of it with the gun in his hand, waiting for a report from the security team. 15 tense minutes crawled by. The radio crackled. Jason Romano's voice clipped. "We caught one. East Garden. Boss, come down." Lorenzo glanced at the children's door, motioned for 2 bodyguards nearby to take position, then headed down to the basement. The room beneath the Caruso mansion wasn't on any blueprint. Soundproof walls, a concrete floor that could be scrubbed clean, and cold white LED lights pouring down like an operating room. The intruder was tied to an iron chair in the middle of the room, his face swollen from a few punches by the guards when he'd tried to fight back. Jason stood beside him, blood still on his hands. He handed Lorenzo a professional camera and a coil of climbing rope. This guy was photographing the mansion's layout, bedroom locations, the kids' room, emergency exits, all of it. Setting up for a large-scale hit. Lorenzo scrolled through the images on the camera, his jaw tightening until the muscles in his face jumped. The intruder lifted his head, his eyes puffed nearly shut, but a sliver of arrogance still there. "Victor Ashworth sends his regards. He says he'll have the heads of those bastard kids before the end of the month." Lorenzo didn't say a word. He took off his suit jacket, rolled up the sleeves of his dress shirt, and walked to the tool table in the corner of the room. What happened next in that soundproof basement, no one knew except Lorenzo and Jason. But on the stairwell leading down, standing in the dark, Ren heard everything. She hadn't obeyed the order to stay in the room. She'd slipped out after placing the children in Frank's hands, the instincts of a mother demanding to know just how big the danger really was. She stood on the stairs with her back against the cold wall and listened to the screams echoing up from below. Begging, agonized howls, bones breaking. Then silence. Wren closed her eyes, her fingers gripping the railing until her knuckles turned white. The man she'd slept beside 2 years ago, the man who was the father of her children, was truly a monster. Not a fairy tale monster, but a real one. Flesh and blood, with hands that could torture an enemy without blinking. And yet at the same time, another thought invaded her mind. That monster had stood in front of her children's door minutes earlier with a gun in his hand. He hadn't run to the breach first. He'd run to Noah and Emma first. He'd stood there like a living shield, ready to take a bullet for them. Wren didn't know what she was supposed to feel anymore. Fear, hatred, or something she didn't dare name. The next night, 3 a.m, Wren couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the screams echoing up from the basement again. She saw Lorenzo standing in front of her children's door with a gun in his hand. Those 2 images kept spinning through her mind, the monster and the protector, torturing an enemy and shielding a child. She didn't know who Lorenzo Caruso really was anymore. She slipped out of bed, checked on Noah and Emma sleeping soundly in their cribs, then quietly went downstairs to make a cup of tea. The mansion's massive kitchen lay in darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the refrigerator and moonlight spilling through the windows. She was heating water when she realized she wasn't alone. Lorenzo sat at the kitchen island with his back to her, a bottle of 20-year Macallan and a glass in front of him. He didn't turn around, but he knew she was there. Can't sleep either. His voice was low and tired, not as cold as it had been during the day. Wren stood still for a moment, weighing whether to go back upstairs or stay. Then she decided. She made Earl Grey, walked over, and sat on the far side of the island, far enough to keep distance, close enough to talk. They sat in silence for a while, each with their drink, not looking at each other. Then Lorenzo spoke, his voice aimed at the darkness more than at her. "I was 12 when my mother died." Wren didn't react, didn't interrupt. She just listened. Lorenzo went on, his eyes fixed on his glass as if he were staring into the past. "The Moretti family wanted to send a message to my father. They kidnapped my mother when she was picking me up from school. They shot her right in front of me. In the street, in broad daylight, I watched her drop, blood spilling onto the sidewalk. I tried to run to her, but my father held me back. He dragged me away and wouldn't let me cry, wouldn't let me look back. He told me tears were a luxury the Caruso heir wasn't allowed to have. Emotion was a fatal weakness in this world. After that, I wasn't allowed to love anyone, wasn't allowed to care about anyone, because anything I loved could be used against me." Lorenzo drained his glass and poured another. "I killed my first man when I was 17, the one who shot my mother. My father put the gun in my hand and told me, if I wanted to be boss, I had to have the courage to look my enemy in the eyes when I pulled the trigger. I did it. I didn't feel anything. And after that, I didn't feel anything for 25 years. Until he stopped, unable to finish. But Wren understood. Until he saw Noah and Emma." Silence stretched. Then Wren spoke, her voice gentle now, no longer sharp the way it had been in the days before. "I went into foster care when I was 3. My mother left me at a gas station and drove away. They never found her." Lorenzo lifted his head and looked at her for the first time. Wren stared down into her tea, her fingers tracing circles along the rim of the cup. 14 years in foster care, 7 different families. Nobody kept me longer than 2 years. One family sent me back because they had a biological baby. One sent me back because I was too old. They wanted someone smaller, cuter. One sent me back because I ate too much. I cost money. Every time I got sent back, I learned a lesson." She raised her head, her green eyes meeting Lorenzo's gray. "I learned not to hope, so I wouldn't be disappointed. I learned not to attach, so it wouldn't hurt when I got abandoned. I learned to take care of myself, because nobody else was going to do it. Megan was the only one who stayed, the only real friend I had through all those years. And she died of cancer the night I met you in that bar." Lorenzo looked at her, not with the eyes of a mafia boss, but with the eyes of a man who'd lost too much. "So that night, we were both falling apart." Wren nodded once. "Maybe that's why we found each other. 2 broken souls recognizing each other in a crowd." They sat there in the dark kitchen, not touching, not needing to, but for the first time since they'd been thrown back together, they weren't enemies anymore. For the first time, They truly saw each other. Not a mafia boss and a maid, not the one who left and the one who got left behind. Just two human beings with scars too deep and too similar. When dawn light began to seep through the window, Ren stood and carried her empty cup to the sink. She paused as she passed Lorenzo, not looking at him, but she spoke softly enough for him to hear. "I still haven't forgiven you. But I'm starting to understand." Then she went upstairs, leaving Lorenzo alone with a bottle slowly emptying and the first light of day driving the darkness back. 4 a.m. the next day. Lorenzo lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, like every night since he'd learned he had children. He was used to insomnia. 20 years in the underworld had taught him that sleeping too deeply was the fastest way to die. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't thinking about enemies or strategy. He was thinking about that conversation in the dark kitchen with Ren, about the way her green eyes had looked at him for the first time without pure hatred. A child's cry burst from the monitor system beside his bed and yanked him out of his thoughts. Lorenzo had installed the monitor in his room the day the children moved in, telling Jason it was for security. But the truth was, he wanted to hear them, wanted to know they were still okay, wanted the feeling of them close, even though he didn't know what to do with that feeling. Emma was crying. The sharp wail cut through the speaker, growing louder, more frantic, more panicked by the second. Lorenzo waited for Ren's soothing voice to follow, but nothing came. He glanced at the monitor screen and saw Noah still sleeping peacefully in the crib beside hers, while Emma had pushed herself upright, her face flushed red, tears streaming down her cheeks, both arms reaching out toward no one. Where was Ren? Lorenzo shot up and ran into the hallway. The bathroom door at the end of the hall was shut, light leaking out from the crack. Ren was in there. Maybe she couldn't hear the crying. Emma's sobs came louder through the monitor tucked into his shirt pocket. Lorenzo stopped at the children's door, his hand closing around the knob, but he didn't push it open. He didn't know what to do. He'd killed men, he'd tortured enemies, he'd run a criminal empire, but he'd never soothed a crying child. He didn't know how to hold a baby. He didn't know what to say, what to do to make the tears stop. His hands that didn't tremble on a trigger, hands that didn't flinch while breaking an enemy, now shook in front of his daughter's bedroom door. Emma cried harder, the sound shifting from fear to desperation, like she believed no one was coming for her. That sound went straight into Lorenzo's chest, like a bullet. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dark, lit only by a rabbit-shaped nightlight, casting a soft yellow glow. Emma sat in her crib with her face soaked, both arms reaching toward the doorway when she saw someone. When her green eyes met Lorenzo's gray eyes, her crying paused for a beat, as if she were deciding whether this person could be trusted. Lorenzo walked to the crib and looked down at his daughter. Emma was tiny, with soft brown curls like her mother's and green eyes fixed on him, waiting. He drew a deep breath, bent down, slid his hands under her arms, and lifted her up. He held her awkwardly, not knowing where to place her, whether he should support her head or her back. Emma let out a few more sobs, almost like she was testing how the man holding her would react. Then she stopped crying, completely. Her green eyes stared at Lorenzo for a long moment, as if she could see straight through his soul. Then Emma did something Lorenzo never expected. She rested her head against his shoulder, her tiny cheek pressing into the fabric of his dress shirt, her little hand gripping his lapel like she was afraid of being left behind. She let out a small sigh, that satisfied sound only children make when they find safety, and then she closed her eyes. Lorenzo stood frozen in the dark room. His daughter was on his shoulder. His daughter had chosen him as shelter. His daughter trusted him enough to sleep in his arms. Something in Lorenzo's chest, something that had been frozen for 25 years since the day he'd watched his mother get shot and hadn't been allowed to cry, began to crack. He felt heat gather behind his eyes, felt something tighten in his throat. He lifted a hand to support Emma's back, clumsy but instinctive, and then he began to sway gently. He didn't know where he'd learned it, maybe from a distant memory of his mother's arms, maybe from an instinct he hadn't known he still carried. In the doorway, Ren stood in the shadows, her hands still wet because she hadn't had time to dry them after washing her face. She'd rushed out when the crying stopped too suddenly, her heart pounding, terrified something had happened, but what she saw made her stop dead. Lorenzo Caruso, the most notorious mafia boss in Chicago, the man the entire underworld feared, stood in the middle of the room under the soft yellow nightlight, swaying with his little girl on his shoulder, gray eyes that were usually cold as steel now shimmering wet. Ren didn't step inside. She stayed in the dark, quietly watching, letting the moment belong to the two of them. And for the first time since she'd seen Lorenzo again, there was no hatred in her eyes, only something softer, something she wasn't ready to name. 1 week after the night Lorenzo held Emma in that dark room, everything inside the Caruso mansion began to change in ways no one saw coming. He came home earlier, spent time watching the children eat dinner, stood in the corner and listened while Ren read to them before bed. He didn't join in. He didn't know how to join in yet, but he was there, and in some strange way, that was enough. But peace never lasted in Chicago's underworld. On the morning of the 7th day, the security cameras caught a convoy moving toward the estate. 5 gleaming black Cadillac Escalades stopped at the iron gate. 20 gunmen in black suits poured out and formed a line like they were stepping into a battle. And in the center of them stood Victor Ashworth, a 62-year-old kingpin with silver hair slicked back and eyes as cold as a snake's. Jason rushed into the study with his face drawn tight. Victor demands to see the boss right now. He says if he isn't allowed inside within 10 minutes, he'll blow up the entire Gold Coast and let the press write about the biggest massacre in Chicago history. Lorenzo rose from his desk and slowly fastened the buttons of his black 3-piece suit. He didn't hurry. He didn't panic. His expression calm, as if he were getting ready to attend his own funeral. He ordered Jason to keep Ren and the children in the safe room in the basement, where the walls were steel and the door was bulletproof. Then he walked out to the gate alone, empty-handed, facing 20 guns aimed at him. Victor Ashworth stood there with a cane topped in silver, a contemptuous smile curling his mouth when he saw Lorenzo appear. Around them, 40 gunmen from both sides formed a lethal circle, fingers resting on triggers, waiting for a signal. The air felt thick with gunpowder and tension. Lorenzo stopped 3 steps from Victor, close enough to see the veins pulsing at the older man's temple, far enough to react if he had to. Victor spoke first, his voice cutting through the quiet morning like a death bell. "Nephew, you've disappointed me. Genevieve's been crying for a week because of the humiliation you caused. You threw away my daughter. You threw away the Ashworth-Caruso alliance. For what? For some cheap whore you picked up in a bar." Lorenzo didn't move, didn't react. He only stared at Victor with gray eyes cold as ice. Victor went on, his tone turning more poisonous by the second. "I looked into that girl, Ren Callahan, an orphan, raised in foster care, a housemaid who goes from home to home like a stray animal. And those bastard children of hers, Noah and Emma, they don't deserve to carry any so-called noble blood. They're the product of a drunk night, nothing more. You're going to destroy the empire your fathers built for a pile of trash." Lorenzo's body went tight like a drawn wire, but he held his ground. Victor stepped closer, his cane tapping the pavement in a steady rhythm like a bomb counting down. "I'm giving you one last chance. Throw the whore and those bastard kids out on the street. Get on your knees and apologize to Genevieve, and I'll pretend this never happened. The Ashworth-Caruso alliance continues, and you stay the boss of Chicago. If you don't, I'll grind you and everything you love into dust. Choose, Lorenzo. The empire or the trash." Victor stopped, waiting with the confidence of a man who believed victory was already in his hand. But he had misjudged Lorenzo Caruso. In a blink, so fast no one could react, Lorenzo drew a Glock from the holster at his lower back and aimed it straight between Victor's brows. 40 guns snapped up at once, 20 Ashworth barrels locked on Lorenzo, 20 Caruso barrels locked on the opposing line. It could explode at any moment. But Lorenzo didn't tremble. His voice carried through the air, stretched tight as wire, cold and certain as steel. "Listen carefully, Victor. Ren Callahan isn't a whore. She's the mother of my children. Noah and Emma aren't bastards. They carry Caruso blood, the blood my father and my grandfather spilled to build this empire. If you say one more word about them, I'll pull the trigger right now and let Chicago drown in blood. I don't care about the consequences. I don't care about alliances or empires. Nobody touches my children." Victor stood there with the muzzle less than a handspan from his forehead, and for the first time in his life he saw something in Lorenzo's eyes he'd never seen in any enemy. Not anger, not recklessness, but a willingness to die, a willingness to burn the entire world if anyone dared touch what he protected. It was the look of a father. The situation stood on the edge of catastrophe. 40 guns were ready to fire, 40 fingers resting on triggers, waiting for a signal. Lorenzo kept his Glock aimed at Victor's forehead, not shaking, not blinking. Victor stood there with an expression that was half contempt and half calculation. weighing whether Lorenzo was truly mad enough to pull the trigger. The air felt sharp enough to cut with a knife. Then footsteps sounded behind Lorenzo, slow, steady, as if whoever it was were strolling through a park instead of stepping into the middle of a lethal standoff. Frank DeLuca appeared, his white silver hair glinting under the morning sun, his gray three-piece suit immaculate as always. In his hand was a yellowed file, pages worn at the corners by time but kept with careful precision. Victor frowned when he saw the old man. Frank DeLuca, the Caruso family butler, a servant not worth Victor's time, but something in Frank's calm gaze made Victor uneasy. Frank stopped beside Lorenzo, said nothing to his boss, only gave a small nod, as if the moment had finally arrived. Then he turned to Victor, opened the file, and began to read in an even voice, like he was reciting a weather report. Victor Ashworth, born in 1963 in Boston, took over the Ashworth family in 1987 after his father died. In 2002, you had an extramarital affair with Maria Santos, a Mexican housemaid in the Ashworth estate. Maria became pregnant and gave birth to a boy in March of 2003. Victor went pale, his snake-cold eyes widened, and for the first time, real panic broke through. Frank continued, his voice still level. The child was named Diego Santos and currently lives in Seattle under the name Daniel Morrison. He is 23 years old this year, works at a technology company, and doesn't know who his biological father is. Victor has paid monthly for 23 years to keep this secret, moving money through an offshore account in the Cayman Islands to avoid detection. The old man stopped reading and lifted his head, his gaze suddenly razor-sharp for someone his age. I've held this file for 20 years, waiting for the right moment. If this information reaches your allied families and your enemies, the Morettis, the Russos, the Colombos, everyone cooperating with Ashworth on the strength of honor and trust, they'll learn Victor Ashworth is a hypocrite. You call Lorenzo's children bastards while you've hidden your own out-of-wedlock son for 23 years. You preach noble blood while you deny your own. The Ashworth empire will collapse because no one trusts a liar. Victor stood frozen, his face ashen, his lips moving but no words coming out. Around him, the 20 Ashworth gunmen began to glance at one another in confusion, unsure how to react to what they'd just heard. Lorenzo lowered his gun slowly, but didn't put it away, his eyes never leaving Victor. You have two choices, Victor, he spoke, his voice cold as ice. 1, you leave right now. Forget about Ren and the children, and this secret stays buried. 2, you keep threatening my children, and tomorrow morning every family in Chicago will receive a copy of this file, along with proof of the offshore transfers. Choose. Victor looked at Lorenzo, looked at Frank, looked at the file in the old man's hand. Rage and humiliation burned inside him, but Victor Ashworth wasn't a fool. He knew when he'd lost. He knew that if this got out, everything he'd built for 40 years would turn to smoke. No one in the underworld forgave lies about blood. Pull back. Victor ordered through clenched teeth, his voice bitter. The 20 Ashworth gunmen lowered their weapons and slowly retreated toward the Escalade convoy. Victor turned to leave, but before he got into the vehicle, he stopped and looked back at Lorenzo one last time. The contempt was gone, replaced by a dark promise. This isn't over, Lorenzo. Then he disappeared into the SUV. The Escalades roared away, and the tension in the air began to loosen. Lorenzo stood there watching the convoy vanish at the end of the road. Then he turned to Frank. The old man stood beside him, the file still in his hand, calm as if the last few minutes hadn't been a deadly standoff. Why did you keep that file? Lorenzo asked. Frank gave a faint smile, a rare expression from a man who'd witnessed too much. Because I knew there'd come a day you'd need it. I've served the Caruso family for 40 years, Lorenzo. I saw how your father loved your mother. I saw how he broke when she died. When I saw the way you looked at those two children, I knew Caruso blood could still love, and I'll protect that, at any cost. Lorenzo looked at the old man who'd been with his family longer than anyone still living. He didn't speak, but he set his hand on Frank's shoulder and squeezed once. It was the deepest thank you Lorenzo Caruso knew how to give. 2 weeks after the standoff with Victor Ashworth, the Caruso mansion settled into a strange calm Lorenzo had never known. No threatening messages, no intruders in the garden, no shadow of the Ashworth family lingering at the edges. Victor had pulled back, at least for now, and Lorenzo finally had time to do something he'd never imagined he would do. Learn how to be a father. He started coming home early every day, Meetings that used to drag past midnight were cut short. Dinners with capos were moved to lunch. Business trips were postponed indefinitely. Jason and the lieutenants exchanged stunned looks, but no one dared to ask. They only knew their boss was changing, and that change had started with two tiny children, one with black hair and one with brown. The first day Lorenzo tried to change Emma's diaper was a disaster. He stood at the changing table with a box of Pampers in his hands, staring down at his daughter lying there with her legs lifted as if she couldn't understand why this man looked so panicked. He opened the dirty diaper, grimaced, then fumbled with the clean one while Emma decided that was the perfect moment to start kicking. The result was a crookedly fastened diaper, talc powder flying everywhere, and a long white streak across Lorenzo's $2,000 vest. But he didn't quit. On the second day, he learned how to mix Similac formula. 5 failures. 5 bottles either too hot or too cold, or clumped because he'd shaken too hard. On the 6th try, he got it right, and when Noah finished the bottle and let out a satisfied burp, Lorenzo felt like he'd just closed $1 million deal. In the evenings, when Ren bathed the children and got them ready for bed, Lorenzo sat nearby with Goodnight Moon in his hands. He read the first lines awkwardly, his deep voice sounding wrong wrapped around gentle words meant for a child. But Noah and Emma didn't care. They lay in their cribs with wide eyes fixed on him, listening like it was the most fascinating story in the world. After 1 week, Lorenzo had Goodnight Moon memorized. After 2 weeks, he added the Very Hungry Caterpillar to the rotation. He read about the hungry caterpillar eating through apples, pears, plums, strawberries, with the solemn intensity of a man negotiating a contract. Noah giggled every time Lorenzo made a caterpillar chewing sound. That morning, Lorenzo was feeding Noah Cheerios in the kitchen. Emma sat in the high chair beside him, busy smearing mashed banana between her fingers. Lorenzo held the spoon and fed Noah one careful bite of cereal at a time, patient enough to wait until the boy finished chewing before offering the next. He'd learned that rushing a child never worked. Noah swallowed the last spoonful, lifted his head, and looked at Lorenzo with gray eyes identical to his. Then the boy opened his mouth and made a sound Lorenzo never thought he'd hear. Daddy. 1 word, 2 syllables, but it hit Lorenzo straight in the chest like a bullet. The spoon slipped from his hand and clattered onto the kitchen floor with a sharp metallic ring. Lorenzo froze, heat flooding his eyes, his lids burning, an emotion he'd buried for 25 years, rising thick in his throat. His son had just called him father. Noah didn't understand why the grown man wasn't moving. He only grinned, clapped his hands, and repeated it like it was a new game. Daddy, Daddy. Ren stood in the kitchen doorway with her morning coffee in hand, seeing everything. She watched Lorenzo, the most powerful man in Chicago, standing in the middle of the kitchen, with eyes gone red from 1 word spoken by a 21-month-old child. She didn't forgive him. Not yet. The wound of 21 months, raising them alone, the sleepless nights with sick babies, the hungry days so she could afford milk. None of it could heal in a few weeks. But as she watched Lorenzo bend to pick up the spoon, wipe his eyes quickly, and keep feeding Noah like nothing had happened, Ren felt something inside her soften. He was trying, truly trying, every day. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth giving him more time. A few days after the day Noah first called Lorenzo Daddy, and exactly 1 month after that miserable birthday no one remembered, Lorenzo came home late from a long meeting with the capos. He was exhausted, his head full of numbers and strategy, plans to expand territory and reinforce new alliances after cutting ties with the Ashworths. The Bentley rolled up to the gate. He stepped out, and he felt it immediately. Something was wrong. The mansion was completely dark. Not a single light glowed. Not a shadow moved behind the massive glass windows. Lorenzo's heart tightened. Survival instinct snapped on, his hand dropping to the holster at his lower back for his Glock. He thought of Victor Ashworth, of that promise of revenge in the older man's eyes the last time they'd faced each other. He thought of Ren, of Noah, of Emma. He ran inside, shoved the front door open, and charged toward the living room with the gun in his hand. The living room was drowned in thick darkness. Lorenzo stopped in the center of it, eyes straining to adjust, ears searching for any suspicious sound. Then the lights came on. Not one, but all of them at once, so bright he had to squint. And when his vision cleared, he went still. Frank DeLuca stood by the light switch, wearing his gray suit as perfectly as always. But there was a rare smile on his lips, the kind Lorenzo had seen only a handful of times in his life. Jason Romano leaned with his arms crossed by the window, his usual hard face softened by a small smile. Lorenzo wasn't sure he'd ever seen before. Ren stood beside the walnut coffee table, the same table the children had destroyed a month ago in their legendary frosting war, and on two high chairs next to her, Noah and Emma sat with chocolate smeared on their hands, eyes bright, grinning wide when they saw him. On the table was a cake, not the flawless cake from the five-star bakery Frank had ordered on that first chaotic night. This cake was smaller, lopsided, uneven. The frosting smeared like it had been spread by someone who'd never baked in her life. Ren had made it herself from a Betty Crocker box she'd bought at Target, and she'd admitted to Frank that she didn't know how to bake, but she wanted to try. The frosting wasn't pretty, thick in some places, thin in others. But what Lorenzo couldn't look away from was what sat on top. Two tiny handprints in chocolate, one Noah's, one Emma's. Ren had dipped their little hands into chocolate and pressed them onto the white frosting, leaving two imperfect but unmistakable prints. And beneath those prints, there were wobbly words written in blue icing. "Happy birthday, Daddy." Singing filled the room. "Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you." Frank sang in a low voice that trembled with age. Jason sang off-key like a man who'd never sung a day in his life. Ren sang softly, her green eyes never leaving Lorenzo. And Noah and Emma babbled along with the melody. Not quite words, not quite on beat, but it was the most beautiful sound Lorenzo had ever heard. He stood there with the Glock still in his hand, his black suit still immaculate, the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, frozen in the living room while 4 people sang him happy birthday. He didn't know how to react. He'd lived 37 years. He'd had dozens of lavish birthdays in the past with expensive champagne and powerful guests. But never, not once, had he had this. A homemade cake, chocolate handprints from his children. A crooked message written in love. The song ended. Emma clapped and laughed. Noah reached toward the cake, demanding a bite. Ren looked at Lorenzo, waiting, unsure if she'd done the right thing. Lorenzo lowered the gun and set it down on the table. Then he walked forward, slowly, like he was afraid that if he moved too fast, everything would vanish like a dream. He dropped to his knees in the middle of the living room, right in front of the 2 high chairs. Noah and Emma stared at him with round eyes, not understanding why the grown man was kneeling. Lorenzo reached out and gently lifted Noah from the chair, then Emma, and gathered both children into his arms. And then Lorenzo Caruso, the mafia boss Chicago feared, the man who hadn't cried since his mother died 25 years ago, cried. He cried without hiding it, tears spilling down his cheeks, falling into Noah's black hair and Emma's brown. He held his children tight, his body shaking with sobs he didn't try to swallow back. Frank turned his head away, wiping his eyes quickly. Jason stared out the window, pretending he was checking security outside. Ren stood there with one hand gripping the chair, tears running down her face, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. She watched the man holding her children and crying, and she knew this was a moment she would never forget. 11 at night, the Caruso mansion fell into silence after the small birthday celebration that had become the most unforgettable night of Lorenzo's life. The children were asleep in their cribs, bellies full of chocolate and frosting, sweet smudges still on their faces, because Ren hadn't bothered to wipe them clean since they looked too adorable while they slept. Frank had gone to his room. Jason had left after one last security check. Lorenzo stood alone in the living room, staring at the lopsided cake still half intact on the table, his children's 2 chocolate handprints still perfect on the white frosting. He didn't want to clear it away. He wanted to keep it forever. He went looking for Ren and found her on the 3rd-floor balcony, where the view of the Chicago skyline was the best in the house. She stood there with her back against the railing, a cup of tea in her hand gone cold long ago, green eyes fixed on the glittering skyscrapers in the night. Lorenzo stepped onto the balcony and stopped a few feet away. He didn't have a diamond ring in his pocket, no prepared speech, no roses or champagne or any of the things romantic men in movies brought. He only had himself, with all the scars and darkness he carried. They stood in silence for a moment as the cold Chicago wind moved through them. Then Lorenzo spoke, his voice low and quiet, no longer the ice it had been in the beginning. "I know I don't deserve it." Ren didn't turn to look at him. She kept her eyes on the skyline, but she was listening. Lorenzo went on, each word pulled from deep in his chest, from the place he'd buried emotion for 25 years. "I'm a monster, Ren. My hands have blood on them, more than you can imagine. My soul is dark. I've done things that can't be forgiven. I've ordered things no normal person could sleep at night knowing. I'm not a good man. I probably won't ever be completely good." He took a slow breath and continued. "I left you alone for 21 months. Even if I didn't know, even if I didn't do it on purpose, it doesn't change the fact that you raised our children in poverty while I lived in luxury. You almost died on that delivery table with no one beside you. You went hungry to buy milk for them. You worked 3 jobs while I drank $1,000 whiskey and complained about being lonely. I don't have the right to ask you to forgive me for any of that." Ren turned and looked at him, her green eyes unreadable in the dim light spilling from the living room behind them. She didn't speak. She just listened. Lorenzo stepped closer, close enough to see strands of her brown hair lifting in the wind, close enough to see the exhaustion beneath her eyes from years of carrying everything alone. "But I promise," he said, his voice trembling slightly with an emotion he didn't try to hide. "On my life, I'll spend the rest of it trying to earn it. For the children. And for you. I'll protect them at any cost. I'll be there for every moment of their lives. I'll read to them every night. I'll teach them to ride a bike. I'll be there when they need their father. And I'll try to become a man worthy of standing beside you, even if I know that could take a lifetime." He paused and looked straight into those green eyes, the eyes that had haunted him for over 2 years since that night in the bar. "I don't have a ring. I don't have a perfect proposal. I only have this question. Will you give me a chance? Not forgiveness right now. Not love right now. Just a chance to prove I can change. A chance to become the father Noah and Emma deserve. A chance for me, maybe one day, to become a man you can trust." The night wind moved again, cold but not enough to chase away the warmth rising between them. Ren looked at Lorenzo, the most powerful man in Chicago, standing in front of her, with his heart wide open. No weapon, no mask, only raw truth and one simple question. She stayed silent. Her green eyes gave him nothing, and he couldn't tell what her answer would be. Ren looked at Lorenzo in a silence that stretched until it felt hard to breathe. The Chicago night wind moved across the balcony, cold, but neither of them seemed to feel it. Then she spoke, her tone steady. Not icy and not warm, just honest. "I'm not saying yes." She paused and held his waiting gray eyes. "I'm also not saying no." Lorenzo stood there without moving, without breathing, waiting. Ren turned back to the Chicago skyline, the skyscrapers glittering like a million stars at their feet. "Prove it," she said, each word clear. "Every day. Not with words, not with pretty promises, with actions, with showing up, with waking up every morning and choosing to be here, choosing to be a father, choosing to keep trying." She looked back at him. "And we'll see." It wasn't a promise of love. It wasn't full forgiveness. It wasn't the answer Lorenzo would have gotten in a romantic movie. But it was a door left slightly open, a sliver of light in the dark, a real chance for him to prove he'd changed. Lorenzo nodded slowly, accepting her condition without a single complaint. He didn't need an answer right now. He'd been waiting for over 2 years without even knowing what he was waiting for. He could wait as long as it took, as long as she gave him the chance to prove it. "I'll prove it," he said, his voice low and solid. "Every day, until you're ready." They stood side by side on the balcony, 2 silhouettes against the Chicago night sky, not touching, not holding hands, not kissing, but closer than they'd ever been. The distance between them was no longer an abyss of hatred and hurt, only a few steps they both knew time would shorten. In the bedroom behind them, Noah and Emma slept soundly in their new crib, a safe crib, in a warm room, with security posted around the clock outside. For the first time in the short 21 months of their lives, the 2 children were truly safe. No more cold studio apartment on the south side. No more nights of Ren staying awake and wondering if she'd have enough money for formula tomorrow. No more invisible fear of an unstable life. They had a father. They had a mother. They had a home. Lorenzo glanced toward the door leading to the children's room, where the rabbit nightlight cast its soft, warm yellow glow. He remembered that miserable birthday only a few weeks ago, sitting alone in his office on the 50th floor, Genevieve leaving without even a single wish, him believing he was the loneliest creature on earth. He'd lost everything since that night. The political marriage to Genevieve had shattered. The alliance with the Ashworth family had ended. New enemies had surfaced, threatening his life and the lives of the people he cared about. The empire he'd built over 9 years now faced its greatest challenge yet. But when he looked into Ren's green eyes, when he remembered Noah saying "Daddy," When he remembered the weight of Emma's head on his shoulder in the dark, Lorenzo Caruso understood a truth so simple it almost stunned him. For the first time in 37 years, he was truly rich. Not because of his empire, not because of bank accounts with 9-digit numbers, not because of the power that made all of Chicago afraid, but because of 2 little children smeared with chocolate sleeping in the room beside him, because of the woman standing next to him, a woman who'd survived hell without breaking. Strong enough not to forgive easily, but still kind enough to give him a second chance. Ren glanced at him, as if she could read what was in his head. "Don't disappoint me, Lorenzo Caruso." He smiled, the first smile in years without bitter nihil calculation behind it. "I won't." They stood there in silence, watching Chicago glitter below, 2 souls that had once been broken now slowly knitting back together. Their story didn't end with a kiss under moonlight or sweet declarations. It ended with a quiet promise, a chance given, and a long road ahead. But that was real life. Not perfect, not easy, but worth fighting for. Lorenzo and Ren's story was a reminder that sometimes the most precious things in life come from the places we least expect. That family isn't always blood. It's the people who choose to stay when the world turns its back. That the past can be dark, but the future can still be bright if we dare to change and keep trying every day. That real love isn't pretty words. It's action. It's patience. It's choosing to love, even when it's hard. And most of all, that it's never too late to become the father, the mother, the partner the people we love deserve. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and share this video so more people can listen. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss new heartfelt stories every day. We'd love to hear what you think. What did this story make you think about in your own life? Do you believe everyone deserves a second chance? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We're looking forward to reading every line that comes from your heart. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story. Wishing you and your family good health, happiness, and peace every day. See you in the next video.